The alarm screamed through Station Helio 7 at exactly midnight. Red lights flashed in every corridor as the lockdown protocol activated. In the Xenobiology Research Wing, something terrible had happened again. Subject K-77 stood over the body of its fourth handler. The creature was only 6 months old, but already as large as a wolf from Earth. Its 6 eyes glowed in the darkness, and its crystalline claws dripped with violet blood. The Kelthar researcher named Bim would never study another specimen. The Apex cub had killed him in less than 10 seconds. Director Velkos watched through the security cameras from his office. His 4 hands trembled as he reached for the communication device. This was the end of the experiment. The Vrakthian species could not be studied, could not be trained, could not be controlled. They were pure killing instinct wrapped in armor-like skin. The galaxy had been right to fear them. The director pressed the button that would send armed security drones to the containment chamber. The kill order was simple and final. Subject K-77 would be terminated immediately. No more handlers would die. No more chances would be given. Hyun was finishing her night shift when the alarm started. She worked as a maintenance technician on the station, fixing broken equipment and keeping the life support systems running. Most of the important alien researchers barely noticed her. Humans were still new to the Galactic Council, and many species saw them as competent but nothing special. Hyun did her job and stayed quiet. The lockdown caught her in Section 7 near the research labs. Heavy doors sealed shut behind her, trapping her in the observation corridor. She could have panicked, but panic was not in her nature. Instead, she walked to the viewing window to see what had caused the emergency. Through the reinforced glass, she saw the creature everyone called K-77. It paced back and forth in its containment chamber, and the body of the dead researcher lay near the far wall. Security drones hovered outside the chamber, their weapons charging with a high-pitched whine. Hyun had heard about this creature, the most dangerous predator ever found, impossible to train. Killed every handler who tried to work with it. But as Hyun watched, something seemed wrong. The creature was not acting like a hunter. Its movements were jerky and anxious. It kept looking at the walls, at the ceiling, at the drones with their weapons. Hyun had studied xenobiology as a hobby during her 2 years on the station. She pulled up her datapad and searched for information about Vrakthian behavior. The database said Vrakthians were aggressive apex, predators, territorial, violent, untrainable, but the posture she was seeing through the window did not match those descriptions. The creature looked distressed, not aggressive. It looked scared. A mechanical grinding sound made Hyun look up. The door leading from the observation corridor to the buffer zone was malfunctioning. The lockdown had damaged something in the mechanism. The door slid open halfway and stopped, sparking. Hyun should have moved away from it, should have called for help. But then she saw the containment chamber door starting to open too. The whole system was failing. Within seconds, there would be nothing between her and the Apex cub except air and bad choices. The security drones received their kill order. Hyun saw the weapons charging to full power. In 5 seconds, they would fire through the opening door and turn the creature into scattered atoms. She thought about letting it happen. This was not her problem. She was just a maintenance worker. But she kept looking at the creature's eyes, 6 eyes that seemed confused and frightened rather than murderous. She thought about the database entry that said Vrakthians were untrainable. That said they attacked without reason. That said they were nothing but killing machines. Hyun had grown up on Earth in the city of Busan. Her grandmother had rescued street dogs that everyone said were too aggressive to save. Mean dogs that bit and snarled. Her grandmother had a saying in Korean that Hyun still remembered. The saying meant that a scared animal was not the same as a mean animal. The chamber door opened another meter. The drones locked their targeting systems. Hyun made a choice that seemed insane even as she did it. She walked through the malfunctioning buffer zone door. She walked toward the containment chamber. She held her hands out to her sides, palms open, showing she had no weapons. And she started talking in Korean. Not commands. Not demands. Just talking. She told the creature about her day. About the broken moisture recycler in Section 4 that had taken her 3 hours to fix. About how tired she was. About how she wanted to finish her shift and go to sleep. Her voice was soft and steady, the same tone she used when her grandmother's old dog got scared during thunderstorms. The creature stopped pacing. All 6 eyes focused on her. The security drones hesitated. Their programming could not account for a station worker walking toward the target. Director Velkos screamed into his communication device, ordering Hyun to evacuate immediately. She could hear his voice echoing through the corridor speakers. She ignored him. Near the observation window, Hyun saw her laundry cart. She had been folding clean uniforms when the alarm started. The cart sat there with half-folded clothes spilling out of it. Without thinking too hard about what she was doing, Hyun sat down on the floor next to the cart. She picked up a uniform and started folding it. Then another. Then another. She kept talking in Korean, kept her movements slow and predictable, kept her breathing calm. The creature watched her with an intensity that should have been terrifying. Hyun folded laundry and pretended she was alone in her quarters, doing the most boring task in the universe. 17 minutes passed, the longest 17 minutes of Hyun's life. Her back ached from sitting on the floor. Her hands moved automatically, folding and stacking. The creature moved closer, one careful step at a time. Director Velkos had stopped shouting. The entire security team watched in silence. Across the galaxy, the emergency broadcast was being monitored by dozens of species. Everyone waited to see if the human would die. The creature crossed the threshold of its containment chamber. It approached Hyun slowly, head lowered. It circled her once, sniffing the air. Then it settled onto the floor beside her, its massive head coming to rest near her knee. Within 3 minutes, the creature was asleep. Its breathing became deep and regular. One of its 6 eyes remained slightly open, watching Hyun's hands as they continued their repetitive folding motion. Hyun sat perfectly still except for her hands. She did not know what would happen if she stopped folding. She did not know if she would survive the next hour. But for this moment, the most dangerous predator in the known galaxy slept peacefully beside her. And she folded laundry like nothing unusual was happening at all. The galaxy watched through the security cameras. Thousands of species across hundreds of worlds saw something they had thought impossible. A human had done what every expert said could not be done. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just watched a tired maintenance worker fold clothes while an apex predator slept beside her like a pet. News traveled fast across the Galactic Council networks. Within 6 hours, every major civilization knew about the human maintenance worker and the sleeping apex predator. The security footage played on information screens from the Kelthar homeworld to the Outer Rim colonies. Scientists, military leaders, and politicians all watched the impossible scene with disbelief. Director Velkos did not sleep that night. He stood in his office reviewing the footage over and over, trying to understand what had happened. The Vrakthian cub should have killed Hyun within seconds. Every piece of research, every documented encounter, every bit of data said that Vrakthians could not be calmed or controlled. Yet this human had sat on the floor folding laundry, and the creature had curled up beside her like a domesticated pet. By morning, representatives from a dozen species had arrived at Station Helios 7. The Galactic Council's Apex Species Research Division sent their top scientists. The military sent observers. The news media sent reporters. Everyone wanted to see the human and the creature that should have been impossible. Hyun woke up on the floor of the observation corridor with a stiff back and a very large predator still sleeping against her leg. She had dozed off sometime around dawn, too exhausted to stay awake any longer. The creature stirred when she moved, all 6 eyes opening at once. For a moment, Hyun wondered if she had only delayed the inevitable. If the creature would attack now that it was fully awake. Instead, it made a sound she had never heard before. A low rumbling that seemed to come from deep in its chest. Not a growl or a snarl, something else. Something that sounded almost like the purring of a cat, but deeper and more complex. The creature stood up, stretched, and looked at her expectantly. Hyun decided to call him Tayo. The name meant great and brave in Korean, and somehow it seemed to fit. She stood up slowly, her joints protesting. Tayo watched her with what she could only describe as curiosity. She took a step toward the corridor. Tayo followed. By the time Hyun reached the main research area, she had a following. Tayo walked beside her like a guard, and behind them came a parade of scientists with cameras and scanning equipment. Director Velkos met them in the central laboratory, his face showing a mixture of professional embarrassment and scientific fascination. The director wanted answers. How had Hyun done it? What technique had she used? Could it be replicated? Hyun tried to explain, but her explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. She had just been herself. She had stayed calm. She had not treated Tayo like a monster or tried to dominate him. She had simply existed near him without fear or aggression. The Keltar researchers did not find this explanation satisfactory. They needed data, methods, reproducible techniques. They set up controlled experiments. They had other researchers try to approach captured Vrachthian cubs using various methods based on what Hyun had done. Every attempt failed. Some failed quickly with the creatures becoming agitated. Some failed slowly with the creatures refusing to engage at all. One researcher named Mullivan tried to replicate Hyun's exact actions with another cub. He sat on the floor. He folded laundry. He spoke in what he thought was a calm voice. The cub attacked him within 4 minutes. Mullivan survived only because emergency barriers dropped in time. His injuries required 2 weeks of medical treatment. The difference became clear through careful analysis. Hyun was not pretending to be calm. She genuinely was calm. The researchers could copy her actions, but they could not copy the emotional state behind those actions. When they looked at a Vrachthian cub, they saw a dangerous predator and felt appropriate fear. When Hyun looked at Tayo, she saw a confused and scared young creature that needed understanding, rather than domination. Doyun came to visit Hyun on the 3rd day. He was older than her by 10 years and had worked on the station for longer. He was one of the few other Koreans in the human contingent, and they had become friends over shared meals and complaints about malfunctioning equipment. Doyun looked worried. He told Hyun that the galactic powers would want to use this ability. If humans could bond with apex predators, they would be pushed into dangerous roles. The military would want human handlers for weapons programs. The research divisions would want human workers for high-risk studies. Humans had finally found something that made them special in the eyes of the galaxy, and that was not necessarily good news. Hyun understood his concern, but she also understood something else. Tayo was not a weapon or a tool. He was an intelligent being who had been traumatized by handlers who treated him like a monster. The more she worked with him, the more she realized that everything the galaxy thought about Vrachthians was wrong. Over the next 3 weeks, patterns emerged. Tayo followed Hyun everywhere the station allowed. He learned her routines. When she worked on repairs, he watched with focused attention. When she ate, he sat nearby, content to wait. When she slept, he positioned himself near the door of her quarters like a guardian. More importantly, Tayo began trying to help. His attempts were clumsy and often counterproductive. His crystalline claws were not designed for delicate electronics. But the intent was clear. He was learning social cooperation, something the research said Vrachthians could not do. Ambassador Mira arrived from Earth in the 4th week. She was a sharp woman in her 50s with the calculating eyes of someone who had spent decades in galactic politics. She met with Hyun privately in a conference room while Tayo waited outside, making anxious sounds at the closed door. The ambassador explained the situation clearly. Humanity had been junior members of the Galactic Council for only 300 years. Most species treated them politely, but saw them as newcomers without any particular advantages. Humans were competent at many things but exceptional at nothing. Until now. If Hyun could bond with an apex predator, maybe other humans could too. If humans had a unique ability to work with dangerous species, that changed the political calculations. It gave humanity something valuable to offer. It gave them leverage and status they had never possessed before. Director Velkos came to Hyun with a formal proposal. She would participate in an expanded study. Other humans would be brought to the station. More Vrachthian cubs would be captured. If the bonding could be replicated, humanity would be granted elevated status in the Council. If it failed or if Tayo ever harmed anyone, all Vrachthians would remain classified as kill-on-sight threats across the galaxy. Hyun felt the weight of the decision. She had not asked for any of this. She had just wanted to finish her maintenance shift and go to sleep. Now she was being asked to potentially change the status of her entire species and determine the fate of another species entirely. Tayo sensed her distress even through the closed door. He made sounds that brought security running, worried he was becoming aggressive. When they opened the door, they found him trying to push one of Hyun's dropped tools under the gap, attempting to return it to her. It was a simple action, but it represented something profound. Tayo understood that Hyun valued her tools. He wanted to help her feel better by returning something she had lost. The security team captured the moment on video. Within hours, it was being analyzed across the galaxy. A Vrachthian showing social awareness and reciprocal care. Impossible according to every study. Yet there it was, recorded and undeniable. Hyun agreed to the expanded program, but she made one condition. She would train other humans in the bonding techniques, not alien researchers. The method depended on something that came naturally to humans, and she did not think it could be taught to species with different psychology. Director Velkos agreed reluctantly. The Galactic Council gave official approval. The HFY bond program was established. 4 more humans were selected and brought to the station. Jiho was a veterinary specialist who had worked with dangerous Earth animals. Yoonji was a child psychologist who understood developmental behavior. Minyo had spent years rescuing abused animals from illegal operations. Sora was a behavioral scientist with 3 degrees in neurobiology. They all shared something that Hyun recognized immediately. When shown footage of Vrakthian cubs, they expressed curiosity rather than fear. They asked questions about the creature's needs and development, rather than about containment and control. They saw beings rather than monsters. 5 new cubs were brought to the station, each with a history of violent encounters. The galaxy watched to see if one human succeeding had been a fluke or if humans genuinely possessed something special. Hyun began training her fellow humans while Tayo watched from nearby. A silent reminder of what was possible when fear was replaced with understanding. The program moved to Kepler Station 3 months after the first successful bonding. The new facility was larger and better equipped, built specifically for the HFY bond program. Representatives from every major civilization maintained offices there, monitoring the project with intense interest. Some hoped it would succeed. Others waited for it to fail so they could say humans had simply been lucky once. The 5 new Vrakthian cubs arrived in reinforced transport containers. Each had killed or injured multiple handlers before capture. The youngest was 4 months old, the oldest nearly 8. They were placed in separate containment areas, and the human handlers were given files detailing each creature's violent history. Hyun gathered her team in the observation room overlooking the containment wing. Tayo sat beside her chair, now large enough that his shoulder reached her waist when he was sitting. The other humans looked nervous but determined. Outside their observation window, 5 dangerous predators paced in their separate chambers. She told them the most important things she had learned. The cubs were not evil or mindless. They were scared and traumatized. Every handler before had approached them with fear or with the intent to dominate. The cubs had responded the only way they knew how, with defensive violence. The humans had to be genuinely calm, genuinely unafraid, and genuinely respectful of the creatures as intelligent beings. Jiho was the first to make contact after Hyun. He chose the cub that had killed its last handler by crushing the handler's environmental suit during a feeding attempt. The cub was large for its age, with darker coloring than Tayo. Jiho decided to call him June. Instead of trying to approach June directly, Jiho started preparing food near the containment chamber. He had studied Vrakthian nutrition and learned that they were not simple carnivores. They needed complex proteins, certain minerals, and specific plant compounds. He prepared meals with care, mixing ingredients and adding seasonings based on what he had learned. June watched through the transparent barrier with all 6 eyes focused on Jiho's hands. After 3 days of watching, Jiho opened the barrier and placed the food inside without entering himself. June approached cautiously, sniffed the meal, and ate slowly. The next day, Jiho prepared the meal inside the chamber while June watched from the far corner. By the end of the first week, June was sitting close enough that Jiho could feel the heat from his body while he worked. Yoonji chose the smallest cub, a female who had been captured young and had spent her entire life in captivity. The research files said she was unpredictable and had bitten 3 handlers badly enough to send them to medical treatment. Yoonji decided to call her Nari, which meant lily in Korean. Yoonji noticed that Nari seemed bored more than aggressive. The containment chamber had nothing in it except walls and a feeding station. No stimulation, no variety, nothing to occupy a young and intelligent mind. Yoonji started bringing objects into the chamber, simple things at first like boxes and cloth. Nari destroyed them immediately, but Yoonji just brought more the next day. Then Yoonji tried something no researcher had considered. She started playing hide-and-seek. She would hide behind the boxes and let Nari find her. At first, Nari seemed confused, then interested, then excited. Within 2 weeks, Nari was initiating the games herself, hiding objects and watching to see if Yoonji would search for them. Minho took the most dangerous cub, a male who had killed 2 handlers and injured 5 others. The file recommended immediate termination, but Minho had worked with aggressive animals before. He recognized the signs of an abused creature lashing out from trauma. He called the cub Kangmin. Minho did not try to interact with Kangmin at all during the first week. He simply sat in the observation area where Kangmin could see him. He read books. He ate his meals. He worked on his datapad. He existed nearby without making demands or threats. Kangmin ignored him at first, then began watching him with suspicious attention. By the second week, Minho moved to sitting just outside the containment barrier. By the third week, he was sitting inside the chamber with his back to the transparent wall, still making no attempt to approach or interact. He just sat quietly, sometimes for hours, showing Kangmin that a human presence did not automatically mean pain or domination. It took 6 weeks, but eventually Kangmin approached Minho during one of his long sitting sessions. The cub circled him several times, sniffing and examining. Then Kangmin settled down 3 meters away and watched Minho read. The next day, the distance was 2 meters. The day after that, Kangmin was close enough to touch, though neither of them moved to make contact. Sora took the scientific approach. She studied everything known about Vrakthian biology and neurology. She documented every interaction, every sound the cubs made, every behavior pattern. She worked with a cub she named Borum, who had a history of sudden aggressive outbursts that seemed to come without warning. Through careful observation, Sora discovered something important. The outbursts were not random. Borum reacted to specific frequencies and handler voices. When handlers gave commands in sharp, high tones, Borum became agitated. When they spoke in lower, modulated tones, Borum remained calm. Sora realized that Vrakthians were extremely sensitive to vocal patterns, possibly more sensitive than any other known species. She started working with Borum using carefully controlled vocal tones. She discovered that certain frequencies seemed to calm Borum, while others caused stress. The finding was significant. It suggested that Vrakthians were not just sensitive to emotions, but to the physical sounds that express those emotions. Within 3 months, all 5 human cub pairs had formed bonds. Each bond was different, reflecting the personalities of both human and cub, but all of them showed the same fundamental pattern. When treated with respect, patience, and genuine care rather than fear or dominance, the cubs responded with cooperation and trust. The Galactic Council scheduled a formal evaluation. The testing would be rigorous and public. Each human cub pair would need to demonstrate control, cooperation, and safety in increasingly difficult scenarios. Success would validate the program and potentially change humanity's status in the galaxy. Failure would end everything, and likely result in the termination of all bonded cubs. The Dreth Empire sent an envoy named Krellmox to observe the testing. The Dreth were a military power that had spent centuries trying to weaponize dangerous species. They had never succeeded in controlling anything as powerful as a Vrakthian. Krellmox made his skepticism clear during the opening ceremonies. He predicted that the bonds would break under stress and that human control was an illusion that would end in tragedy. The first test required each cub to respond to recall commands in a large, open area filled with distractions. Food, interesting objects, and simulated prey movements were all present. The cubs needed to return to their handlers on command despite these distractions. All 5 cubs performed better than expected. They showed clear preference for their handlers over any distraction. Tayo, watching from the observation area since he was not part of the official test, became agitated when Hyun entered the testing ground. His distress was obvious, and he only calmed when Hyun completed the test and returned to him. The second test measured non-aggressive response to perceived threats. Each cub was exposed to sudden loud noises, aggressive holographic displays, and simulated attack scenarios. They needed to remain calm and look to their handlers for guidance rather than responding with violence. Again, the cubs succeeded. When the simulated threats appeared, they positioned themselves near their handlers in protective stances but did not attack. They watched for cues from the humans, responding to calm voices and gentle touches rather than acting on instinct. The third test involved problem-solving cooperation. Each human cub pair faced a puzzle that required both to work together to solve. The puzzles tested whether the cubs could understand human communication and coordinate their actions. Nari and Yunji solved their puzzle first, working together to move heavy objects into position. Jun and Jiho were close behind, with Jun using his strength while Jiho provided direction. The other pairs completed their puzzles with varying levels of efficiency, but all demonstrated that Vrakthians could engage in cooperative problem-solving. The fourth test created a problem. Each pair would be evaluated on behavior around other species. Representatives from different civilizations would approach the human cub pairs in controlled scenarios. The cubs needed to remain calm and non-threatening. Krelmox volunteered to be part of this test. He approached Kangmin and Minho with deliberate aggression in his posture. The Dreth warrior moved in ways designed to trigger a predator response. Kangmin reacted immediately, moving between Krelmox and Minho with claws extended. For a terrible moment, it seemed like Kangmin would attack. The observers held their breath. Security systems armed themselves. Director Velkos reached for the emergency containment controls. Minho stepped between them. He placed his hand on Kangmin's shoulder and spoke in the low, calm tones he had used during all those weeks of patient sitting. He told Kangmin that everything was fine, that Krelmox was not a real threat, that they were safe. Kangmin listened. The cub's claws retracted. The aggressive posture relaxed. Instead of attacking, Kangmin moved to stand beside Minho, still watchful but no longer T. 6 months after the successful testing, the HFY bond program had expanded significantly. 20 human cub pairs existed across multiple facilities. The cubs were no longer cubs. They were adolescents, growing rapidly and becoming more powerful each week. Tayo now stood as tall as Hyun's shoulder when on all fours, and his weight had tripled. His claws could tear through metal plating, and his strength was enough to bend structural supports. Yet the bonds held. Tayo still followed Hyun through her daily routines, still watched her work with focused attention, still made that deep rumbling sound when she returned after being away. The other pairs showed similar stability. The humans and Vrakthians had become partners in ways that continued to surprise the scientific observers. Hyun had changed roles. She no longer worked as a maintenance technician. Her new position was somewhere between researcher, trainer, and advocate. She wrote reports for the Galactic Council, explaining what she had learned about Vrakthian psychology. She gave presentations to skeptical alien scientists, arguing that Vrakthians were not monsters but intelligent beings who had been fundamentally misunderstood. The work was exhausting. The political pressure was constant, but Hyun believed in what she was doing. Every time she looked at Tayo, she saw proof that connection was possible across seemingly impossible divides. Not everyone shared her optimism. The Dreth Empire continued to oppose the program through official channels. They were joined by the Qualm Cooperative, a coalition of species that viewed any apex predator as an existential threat. The Qualm had lost entire colonies to dangerous species in their history, and they could not accept that Vrakthians might be anything other than weapons of destruction. The Qualm pushed for legislation that would classify all Vrakthians as prohibited life forms. Their proposal demanded the extermination of every Vrakthian in captivity, including the bonded adolescents. The measure was scheduled for a council vote in 3 months. Meanwhile, in a different section of Kepler Station, the Qualm Cooperative was conducting their own research. They had captured 3 adult Vrakthians and were attempting to control them through neural implants. The technology forced obedience by causing pain when the creatures tried to resist commands. The Qualm believed that if dominance through bonding was impossible, perhaps dominance through technology could work. Their research was classified, but rumors spread through the station. Hyun heard whispers about the Qualm program from other humans who worked in maintenance and support roles. People who were overlooked and ignored often learned things that were supposed to be secret. Hyun tried to investigate, but the Qualm section was heavily restricted. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning during a routine research session. Hyun was working with Tayo in one of the training areas when the alarms activated. Not the standard lockdown alarm from before, but the emergency evacuation signal, the kind that meant immediate danger to the entire station. The announcement came over the communication system in multiple languages. Containment breach in Section 12, the Qualm research area. 3 adult Vrakthians had escaped their cells and were moving through the station. All personnel were ordered to sealed emergency shelters immediately. Hyun ran to the nearest monitor and pulled up the security feeds. What she saw made her blood turn cold. The 3 adult Vrakthians were fully grown, each one massive and terrifyingly powerful. They moved through corridors with devastating speed, their neural implants sparking and malfunctioning. The pain from the failing technology had driven them into a rage beyond anything the cubs had ever shown. Security forces engaged the adults with heavy weapons. Nothing worked. The adults tore through reinforced barriers like paper. Energy weapons that could stop most dangerous species barely slowed them down. The adults were heading toward the residential sections where hundreds of people lived and worked. A message came through on Hyun's personal communicator. Ambassador Mira, her voice tight with controlled panic. There were children in the residential section. A school group visiting from one of the Terran colonies, touring the station to learn about humanity's role in the galaxy. 50 children between the ages of 8 and 12 along with their teachers. The security forces could not stop the adult Vrakthians in time. Casualties would be catastrophic. Hyun looked at Teo. He sensed her distress immediately and moved closer, making questioning sounds. The protocol was clear. All bonded Vrakthians were to remain in their secured areas during any emergency. The containment doors were already sealing, keeping Tayo and the other adolescents locked safely away from the crisis. But Hyun understood something that protocol did not account for. She had spent a year learning how Vrakthians thought. They were not solitary predators. They were pack animals. The adults rampaging through the station were in pain and confused, but they were still Vrakthians. And the adolescents might be able to reach them in ways that weapons and barriers could not. Doyen appeared in the doorway, breathless from running. He had been working in a nearby section when the breach occurred. He looked at Hyun and immediately understood what she was thinking. He started arguing before she could even speak. She could not release Teo. She could not risk everything they had built. If the adolescents joined the rampage or if Tayo attacked anyone, the program would end immediately. Every Vrakthian in the galaxy would be hunted to extinction. Hyun listened to his arguments. They were logical and correct, but she thought about 50 children hiding in a residential section, while 3 pain-maddened adults tore their way closer. She thought about Tayo, who had never hurt her in a year of constant contact, who had learned to be gentle despite his growing strength, who looked at her now with trust and concern. She overrode the containment locks. The door to Tayo's area opened. She told him what she needed even though she was not sure he understood human language beyond simple commands and tone. She needed him to help, to protect, to be the best version of what a Vrakthian could be, rather than what the galaxy expected them to be. Tayo moved through the open door without hesitation. Hyun contacted the other handlers through the emergency network. One by one they made the same impossible choice. The containment areas opened. 8 adolescent Vrakthians entered the corridors, each one following their bonded human. The security teams watching through cameras thought they were witnessing a nightmare. Now there were 11 dangerous predators loose on the station instead of 3. Director Velko screamed into his communication device, demanding that Hyun explain what she had done. She had no good explanation. She just trusted Teo more than she feared what might happen. The adolescents moved fast, following their humans toward the residential sections. They did not run wildly. They moved with purpose and coordination. When they reached the corridor where the adults were tearing through another security checkpoint, the adolescents spread out into a formation that showed clear tactical thinking. Tayo took the lead position. He was the oldest and largest of the adolescents, and the others seemed to accept his authority naturally. The humans positioned themselves near evacuation routes, ready to guide civilians to safety. Then Teo made a sound that Hyun had never heard before. It was not a growl or a roar. It was a complex vocalization that carried through the corridors, rising and falling in patterns. The other adolescents joined in, creating a chorus that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The 3 adults stopped their rampage and turned toward the sound. What followed was not a battle but something stranger. The adults charged at the adolescents with the same devastating speed they had shown earlier. But the adolescents did not attack. They dodged and evaded, leading the adults in a complex pattern that kept them away from the residential sections. They were hurting the adults, using their own bodies as bait to redirect the rampage. Sora, watching from a secure location with sensor equipment, noticed something crucial in the biological data. The vocalizations the adolescents were making fell into specific frequency ranges, the same frequencies she had discovered calmed Vrakthians during her early research. The adolescents were trying to communicate with the adults, trying to reach past the pain and confusion to the intelligence beneath. Minho realized what needed to happen. They had to remove the neural implants. The devices were causing constant pain, keeping the adults in a state of permanent aggression. But getting close enough to an adult Vrakthian to remove an implant seemed like suicide. Hyun made another choice that defied all reasonable caution. She walked into the corridor where the largest adult was facing off against Teo and two other adolescents. She carried a neural disruptor, a device that could shut down the implant from close range. Very close range. Within 2V, what they were seeing. Every species in the galaxy knew you did not approach an enraged apex predator. It was the kind of obvious survival instinct that did not need to be taught. Yet this human walked calmly toward a creature that had killed hundreds, protected only by an adolescent who was less than a year old. Tayo positioned himself between Hyun and the adult. He did not attack or threaten. He simply stood his ground, making those complex vocalizations. The adult, confused by this non-threatening behavior from what should have been prey or a rival, hesitated. The malfunctioning implant sparked, sending. The footage spread across the galaxy faster than any news in recent history. Within hours, billions of beings across hundreds of worlds watched the security recordings. They saw Hyun walk calmly toward an enraged apex predator. They saw Teo stand between his human and the adult, not attacking but protecting. They saw an impossible partnership between species that should have been natural enemies. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Representatives from every major civilization gathered to discuss what the incident meant. The Dreth Empire and Quam Cooperative tried to argue that the event proved the danger of working with Vrakthians. They pointed to the rampage, the destruction, the near catastrophe. Their arguments fell flat. Everyone had seen what actually happened. The danger had come from the Quam's own attempts to control through pain and technology. The solution had come from humans choosing connection over control. The debate lasted 3 days. In the end, the Council voted to grant humanity full member status with a seat on the High Council itself. It was an unprecedented elevation. Most species took 500 years of membership before reaching High Council status. Humanity had done it in 300 years. And the final push had come from a maintenance worker who folded laundry, while an apex cub slept beside her. Ambassador Mira accepted the honor on behalf of humanity, but she negotiated additional terms. Recognition of Vrakthian rights as intelligent beings, protection for all bonded Vrakthians, an end to experiments that caused pain or trauma. The Council agreed to all terms. The alternative was admitting they had been wrong about an entire species for centuries, and politicians preferred progress to admitting past mistakes. Hyun barely noticed the political changes. She was too busy with the 3 adult Vrakthians who had been rescued from the Quam program. The adults were injured, traumatized, and confused. The neural implants had been removed, but the damage from months of constant pain and forced obedience went deeper than physical wounds. She named the largest adult Hajun, which meant summer and talented. Hajun was the one she had approached during the crisis, and he seemed to remember her. When she entered his medical chamber, all 6 of his eyes tracked her movement, but he did not show aggression. Just wariness and exhaustion. Doyen volunteered to work with Hajun. He had argued against releasing the adolescents during the crisis, but he had watched what happened. He had seen Hyun walk toward certain death and emerge unharmed because she trusted Tayo completely. He wanted to understand that kind of trust. He wanted to build it himself. The process was slow. Hajun had learned that humans meant pain and control. Doyen had to patiently demonstrate that not all humans were the same. He spent weeks just sitting near Hajun's recovery area, doing paperwork and eating meals, showing that he was safe and consistent. Hajun watched him with the intensity of a creature that had learned trust was dangerous. It took 2 months, but gradually Hajun began to relax around Doyen. The adult Vrakthian was far more cautious than the cubs had been. He had reasons to fear based on experience, but Doyen was patient, and eventually Hajun approached him during one of his sitting sessions. The adult settled near Doyen, still watchful but willing to share space. It was progress. Not all adults could be rehabilitated. Some were too damaged by their experiences. Some had been in captivity for years, subjected to experiments and abuse that left psychological scars too deep to heal. But the success rate was far higher than anyone had predicted. Vracthions, it turned out, had remarkable capacity for forgiveness when given genuine care. The discoveries kept coming. Sora's research team found ruins on several planets that had been marked as Vracthian hunting grounds. The ruins showed evidence of complex architecture, written language, and sophisticated technology. The galaxy had assumed Vracthians were primitive predators, but the evidence suggested they had once possessed advanced civilization. The Galactic Council authorized an expedition to the Vracthian homeworld. The planet had been quarantined for 200 years after multiple failed colonization attempts. Every species that tried to establish a presence had been wiped out by the native Vracthians within months. The planet was classified as a death world, beautiful but completely hostile to settlement. Hyun was chosen to lead the expedition. She would bring Tayo and 7 other bonded pairs. The mission was considered extremely dangerous, but it was also necessary. If Vracthians had once been civilized, something had destroyed that civilization. Understanding what happened might be crucial to helping the species recover. The journey took 3 weeks through hyperspace lanes. Hyun spent the time reviewing everything known about Vract Prime, which was very little. Most information came from automated probes that had been destroyed within hours of landing. A few manned expeditions had made it to the surface, but none had survived longer than 3 days. When they arrived in orbit, Tayo became agitated in ways Hyun had never seen. He made sounds that seemed mournful, pacing in the observation areas and staring at the planet below. The other bonded Vracthians showed similar behavior. Whatever they were feeling, it was deep and emotional. The landing team set down in an area that probes had identified as the ruins of a major city. What they found stunned everyone. The city had not been destroyed by war or natural disaster. It had simply been abandoned. Buildings stood empty but intact. Streets showed signs of hasty evacuation, but not panic or violence. Sora's team found medical facilities with records still preserved in data storage systems. As they translated the files, a terrible picture emerged. A plague had swept through the Vracthian population about 200 years ago. The disease had killed 90% of the population within months. The survivors, traumatized and without their complex social structures, had scattered into the wilderness. The Vracthians were not primitive predators. They were the traumatized remnants of a civilization that had collapsed from disease. The violence that the galaxy feared was the behavior of survivors who had lost everything, and everyone they knew. They had been trying to protect what remained of their species the only way they knew how. Tayo and the other bonded Vracthians moved through the ruins with obvious grief. They could not have memories of this place, but something in their genetic memory or cultural knowledge recognized it as home. Hyun watched Tayo examine buildings and objects with gentle care, as though trying to understand what his people had lost. When they reached the central plaza, Tayo released a vocalization that carried across the empty city. Within minutes, wild Vracthians began emerging from the surrounding forests. They approached cautiously, drawn by the sounds of their own kind. The wild Vracthians were not attacking. They were coming home. Over the following weeks, a remarkable thing happened. The bonded Vracthians became bridges between humans and the wild population. They demonstrated that humans were safe, that cooperation was possible. The wild Vracthians, seeing their own kind living peacefully with humans, began to remember something from before the plague. Something about trust and community and working together. The expedition established the first permanent settlement on Vract Prime in 2 centuries. It was small and careful, but it proved that coexistence was possible. More humans arrived, trained in the bonding techniques. More wild Vracthians joined the settlement, drawn by the promise of safety and community. Sora's team found libraries preserved in underground archives. They discovered that Vracthian civilization had been built around empathic communication and collective emotional regulation. The species that the galaxy feared as mindless killers had once produced poetry, philosophy, and engineering marvels. They had been artists and scientists, families and friends. The revelation was humbling for the Galactic Council. How many other species had they misjudged? How many others were classified as dangerous or primitive when the truth was more complex? 2 years after that first night with the laundry, Hyun stood in the reconstructed central plaza of the Vracthian capital. Tayo rested beside her, fully grown now and powerful enough to tear apart vehicles. Around them, wild Vracthians interacted with bonded ones and with humans. Children from both species played in spaces that had been empty for centuries. Yunji brought news. The first Vrakthian cub born in captivity to a rehabilitated mother had just hatched. The mother was calm and nurturing, displaying all the parental behaviors the old research said were impossible. She trusted Yunji to help with the cub's care. Understanding that humans were part of her pack now, a message came from Earth. The Terran government wanted to establish a formal interspecies bonding institute, training humans to work with dangerous and misunderstood species across the galaxy. They wanted Hyun to lead it. The position came with authority, resources, and the chance to shape how humanity interacted with other species for generations. Ambassador Mira offered Hyun another option, a position on the High Council, representing both human and Vrakthian interests. It would mean leaving the hands-on work, but having real political power to protect rehabilitated Vrakthians everywhere. Hyun thought about both offers while folding clean clothes in her quarters. The habit had never left her. Teo watched from his usual position near her, head tilted in that questioning way he had. He could not understand the choices she faced, but he knew she was troubled. In the end, Hyun chose to stay with the rehabilitation program. The political work was important, and she recommended Doyun for the council position. He had learned what she already knew about trust and patience, but Hyun understood that real change did not happen in government buildings. It happened in small moments between beings who chose connection over fear. She kept training new handlers. She kept working with traumatized Vrakthians. She kept folding laundry and staying calm and showing that the most powerful weapon in the galaxy was not force or technology, but genuine care. 5 years after that first night, Vrakth Prime had a population of 50,000. Rehabilitated adults, bonded cubs grown into adults, and wild individuals who joined the growing civilization. Human handlers were common throughout the settlements, partners rather than masters. The Interspecies Bonding Institute expanded to work with 17 other species that had been classified as too dangerous to approach. In every case, the human approach succeeded where force had failed. Curiosity without dominance, care without control, trust built through patience and genuine respect. Hyun trained new handlers using the same method she had started with. She had them sit with baskets of laundry and talk about their day while they folded. It seemed silly, but it taught the essential skill, being genuinely calm, comfortable with routine, unthreatened by power. The handlers who succeeded were not the ones who learned to fake calmness, but the ones who genuinely felt it. Tayo, now massive and scarred from helping other traumatized Vrakthians, remained her constant companion. He had helped raise generations of cubs, teaching them the ways of their recovered culture while keeping his bond with Hyun. The galaxy no longer saw him as an apex predator to fear. They saw him as proof that connection was possible across any divide. In the Vrakthian Cultural Center, children from dozens of species watched historical recordings. They saw the footage of that first night. A young human woman sitting on the floor folding uniforms, a dangerous predator approaching slowly, then curling up beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. A young student asked why the human did not run away. The teacher, who happened to be Sora, smiled and explained, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is be yourself. Trust that connection is possible even when everyone says it is not. Keep folding laundry while the universe watches to see if you will break." Outside the cultural center, humans and Vrakthians worked together, rebuilding a civilization that had almost died. Saved not by weapons or technology, but by one tired maintenance worker who chose to trust instead of fear, who folded laundry while an apex cub watched, and in that simple act, changed the galaxy forever.